Shit. Matt knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and now the owner of the firm he worked for wanted to see him immediately. He stood up and headed toward Dan Connor's office. His thoughts were racing. There was no way Dan would know about this. As accountant and general manager, Matt was the only one who saw the details of the company's transactions, and by the end of the month, all the accounts were balanced. Matt was sweating and feeling sick as he reluctantly knocked on the door. He reminded himself that Dan never checked the detailed accounts unless there were obvious discrepancies in the balance sheets. He was always more concerned with his designer suits, fast cars, and chasing women. Dan looked serious and nodded to the chair as Matt entered. Matt's illusion of security was immediately shattered. "I guess the question I need to ask is, how long have you been ripping me off?" Matt's head began to spin. "What? I have no idea what you're talking about." He continued to deny until Dan provided transaction logs proving that a significant amount of money had spent some time in one of Matt's personal accounts before being returned to the company. He realized he had been caught red-handed. "I'm sorry, Dan. I just needed a short-term loan until the temporary loan company got in touch. Otherwise, we would have lost the new house Susan was counting on. I didn't steal it. I paid it back as soon as I could and before the end of the month. I don't know how they classify it, Matt, as theft or fraud, but you're facing jail time. Even without that, you could lose your job. I can't trust you after this." "Please give me a chance. It was a moment of madness. I've been with the company for almost 20 years, and I've never thought of doing anything like this before, and I won't do it again." Dan stood looking out the window, seemingly in deep thought. "You and Susan have been my friends for a long time. I guess that makes the situation even more frustrating. Did Susan know you did it?" Matt was surprised by the question. He wondered, it had actually been Susan's idea. She was so desperate not to lose the house that she had suggested it, assuring Matt that no one would ever find out. Matt thought that involving Susan might mean that Dan wouldn't report it to the police, but he didn't want to implicate her. And after a long pause, he said, "No, she's not the one who knows. It was my idea." Dan seemed surprised by Matt's answer, but let it pass his ears. "I need time to think it over, Matt. I'm not sure how best to proceed. Go home, don't come back for the rest of the week. I'll make a decision on Friday." All the way home, Matt couldn't figure out how Dan knew about it, after all. No one ever went over the deals, and Dan certainly didn't handle the details. His biggest concern was which option Dan would choose. None of them were very appealing, but the embarrassment of a court case and jail time was throwing him into a blind panic. He knew Susan wouldn't be expecting him. Looking at their new house, he deeply regretted buying the damn thing in the first place. He suddenly remembered all those stories where the guy comes home early in the morning and discovers his wife is having an affair. Wouldn't that be the end of a perfect day? Fortunately, when he entered the kitchen, Susan was as bright, sunny, and fully dressed as usual. He marveled again at her beauty. She was barely 40 years old. Her long, curly brown hair was styled in a coiffure and lay over deep brown eyes. He liked her figure better, with a few curves and a lot more cleavage than when they'd first gotten married. Most of all, he liked her smile, which he was going to put away for the foreseeable future. Matt told Susan about his conversation with Dan and what evidence he had. Susan replied, "Oh my God, honey, I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. It was my idea and all for this stupid house." Matt shrugged. "I told Dan you don't know anything. It's pointless to get us both into trouble." Susan, "Maybe if I talk to him and ask him?" Matt thought about it and suggested they just wait. He knew this was going to be the longest 3 days of his life. They could try begging if Dan chose the option of destruction. He wondered what he would do if he were Dan. They were friends outside of work. They often met up and attended parties together. Maybe that gave him a small chance. Dan sent a text telling them he was coming over to their house at 7 p.m. on Friday night. Both Matt and Susan were sick with anticipation. Dan's Aston Martin pulled up to the house just in time. The man who has everything, Matt reflected. Good looks, money, the ability to charm, and now also the ability to destroy it. He ushered Dan forward. A few strained greetings, and Susan, as usual, offered him a beer. Before he could say anything, Matt stepped into the conversation. "I just want to say I'm really sorry, Dan. I've let you and myself down big time. I realize I've put myself in a desperate situation, and I can handle whatever decision you make." Dan smiled oddly. "I really hope that's true, Matt." The ensuing silence stretched on, becoming unbearable before Dan finally continued. "You know, I'm a little jealous of you, Matt. Your relationship with Susan, I miss that in my life." Matt was surprised. He had always thought Dan had everything, including an endless string of hot girlfriends. Maybe approaching 30, he was going to settle down. "So, with that in mind, I have a suggestion. It won't please either of you, but it's the only scenario in which you can avoid jail time, Matt. And remember, there is a risk to Susan as well, since the account was joint and used to secure a house in both your names. Also, I know you wouldn't have done this without her consent." Matt panicked at the thought of Susan being held accountable. He had no idea what that sentence might include. Dan took a slow, long breath. "It's not easy to say, but my suggestion is that I spend time with Susan." There was a stunned silence. Dan continued. "No police, no court cases or jail. You stay at work, you stay together, but I will spend every Friday night with her." "Dan, you can't be serious," Matt whispered. "Dan, I am totally serious. I have desired Susan all these years, and this is an opportunity I just can't resist." "Susan, there has to be another option. We can pay more, anything but—" "Dan, this is my only offer. I've been told I'm not looking too bad. I hope it's not too heavy a burden for you. Perhaps when things settle down, the arrangement won't be too uncomfortable for either of us. Susan, we need time to think about it. We can't decide something like this quickly." Matt turned his head. "You can't think about agreeing to this, baby. Are you crazy?" "Susan, I don't see any alternatives, dear, and we've been trying to think of them all week." Matt growled, looking at Dan. "You pathetic low-life scum. This is a sick idea." Dan smiled back. "That may be true, Matt, but I'm not a thief. You are." Dan turned to Susan. "If we're doing this, we need to start right now. You don't have time to figure out how to get out of this." After 15 minutes of yelling and accusations, Dan stood up. "Time to decide. I'm either going to the car or I'm going upstairs with Susan." He smiled and held out his hand to Susan. After some hesitation, Susan took it. Matt was literally stunned and abruptly sat back in his chair. "Susan, Matt, we have no alternative. Everything will be fine." She then led Dan through the living room and up the stairs. Time seemed to stop for Matt. There was silence in the room. Had this conversation really just happened? His thoughts jumped to what was happening upstairs. He heard them moving around, a muffled conversation, and then the distinct sound of someone sitting on the bed. Long minutes passed in silence. Then he heard the first creak of the bed, the unmistakable sound of two people beginning to have sex. The movements and sounds continued. Then the creaking became regular, and combined with the muffled moans, it became faster and louder. There seemed to be no end to it, and Matt thought that maybe he was going crazy. Matt felt ashamed and guilty. He wiped his cheeks and eyes, waiting for Dan and Susan to come back downstairs, but again there was muffled talking and some movement. After a long silence, Matt stood up, thinking he should check to see if Susan was okay, when he heard something again. The creaking of the bed. He walked to the foot of the stairs and heard something else, including snippets of Dan talking. "That's it, baby." The most discouraging sound, however, was Susan's fairly constant whimpering, occasionally interspersed with "yeah" and Matt needed to get out of the house. He hurried out and walked aimlessly down the street. Was Susan really enjoying this, or was she putting on a show for Dan? He began to wonder how vigorously she objected to the idea. He was not unmoved by the fact that Dan was 10 years younger than him and handsome. By the time he reached the park, his thoughts had changed. Susan was doing this to keep him out of jail. He needed to get back to the house and make sure she was okay as much as possible. Aston Martin was still there, but the house was quiet when he entered. He made his way to the kitchen and grabbed a beer. Turning around, he saw Susan behind him in a short robe. They looked at each other, both confused, before Matt could speak. "Are you okay?" Susan smiled weakly. "Yeah, thanks for asking," then continued. "He's being nice, nothing rough or weird, just normal sex. I'm sorry if you heard something." Matt shrugged. At least it's over. Susan looked uncomfortable and replied, Actually, he wants to do it again. He was thirsty, so I came to get a beer and wanted to check on you. Geez, he must have been saving it for you. Susan. Why don't you go to the den? You'll feel better there, maybe quieter. See if you can figure a way out of this. Matt stayed in the room for another hour and had made no progress toward a solution when he heard footsteps coming down the stairs. He stepped out into the hall and saw Dan suppress a smile before breaking the awkward silence. Look, I know this isn't easy for you, Matt. I promised to treat Susan with the utmost respect, and I can't thank you enough for letting me spend time with her. I hope you feel better, and of course work matters will remain between us. Matt replied, Don't thank me. You left us no choice. Dan and Susan both looked uncomfortable. Obviously, it was time for him to leave. To Matt's surprise, as Dan was saying goodbye, Susan kissed him. It wasn't a blazing kiss, but it was on his lips and lingered for a second. Matt didn't have time to say anything before Dan was gone. He looked at Susan. What the hell was that? Susan realized she had made a mistake. What? Oh, it was just a kiss. Goodbye. No, not just. It was a sign of affection. I think you two had a good time, and I shouldn't have been so worried. Susan got angry. I can't believe your boss just screwed me 3 times thanks to your actions, and you're worried about a goodbye kiss. Matt. It was supposed to be a deal. An arrangement. Just sex. Did you kiss him upstairs? Susan. I guess a little, but not much. Matt. Great. First a few times, then I hear you like it, and now some caresses too. In response, Susan became enraged. It's not like that. Everything I do is designed to keep us out of jail. I will have to be willing and make him enjoy himself. We're both going to have to get used to this. If I can get through it, you have to find a way to get through it too. That last remark knocked all the energy out of Matt. Despite his doubts about her actions, Susan had made the sacrifice, not him. She could have just walked away. And where would he be then? Probably in jail. Matt couldn't be in the master bedroom knowing what had happened there, so they slept in the guest room, snuggled together. Susan fell fast asleep, no doubt exhausted. Matt didn't sleep a wink. His mind was in constant turmoil, desperately trying to think of a way out of this hell. It seemed that for the whole of the next week, they hardly spoke at all. The only topic of conversation was how to get out of their predicament. Matt came up with various plans, most of which were useless. Even when a viable solution occurred to him, Dan seemed to be ahead of him. One of them included the idea of destroying all evidence, only to find out that Dan had deleted his access to backups and claimed he had stored all financial data in a new secure cloud system. Eventually, the next Friday came around, and Dan sent a text saying he intended to take Susan out to dinner, under the pretense that it would make things easier to handle. Matt wasn't sure it was easier. On the one hand, a date felt more like a relationship. On the other hand, it meant less time in bed with Susan. As it turned out, he got the worst of both options. Susan seemed very depressed about the idea of a date, but still prepared herself. Matt thought she put too much effort and looked too good when Dan came to pick her up. Watching her in a little black dress and stiletto shoes being ushered into Dan's Aston Martin was heartbreaking. The evening that followed was even worse. He sent Susan numerous texts, asking if she was okay. Each time he received a short reply saying she was fine, just having dinner or just drinking. Eventually, they got back at 10 p.m. Dan hugged Susan as they entered the house. They were both laughing and seemed to be in good spirits. Matt looked around. Susan seemed to be having too good a time again and was quite drunk. We never agreed this was going to be a dating thing. Dan replied, Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and drinks between friends. If this is going to be awkward, maybe we should just go straight up. Matt growled. What do you mean, right away? Dan's smile returned. We made a deal every Friday, Matt, so tonight I'll sleep with Susan, and I'm sure you'll manage in the spare room. Drunk or not, Susan recognized the tension. Thinking Matt was going to attack Dan, she led him into the kitchen, whispering, It'll be okay, honey. I'll deal with him quickly, and then I'll pretend to be drunk and go to bed. Remember, we don't have a choice. Matt withdrew, feeling an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. He heard Susan giggling as they went upstairs, which he hoped was a pretense for Dan, but he couldn't help but wonder if it was a pretense for Dan or for him. An exhausted Matt finally went to bed in the spare room. Every time he woke up, he heard the creak of the bed in the bedroom, so much for quickly feeling pulled apart. When he came downstairs in the morning, Dan was already sitting at the table and Susan was making breakfast. He'd had enough. "Piss off, Dan. It's not Friday and your time is up." Susan began with, "That's not necessary, Matt. We can be polite. It's just—" Matt interrupted, "You have 10 seconds to get out of my house." Dan looked like he was about to argue but got up to leave, and as he walked out the door, he reminded Matt, "Don't forget what you can get out of this, Matt." Matt turned to Susan. "Make him breakfast, really? You've got to be kidding me. Why don't you just move in with him? You're more his wife now than mine." He ran out before she could think of a response. On the third Friday, Dan suggested they spend the night in a hotel to avoid further confrontation with Matt. Susan left at 6 p.m. dressed as usual, which she thought would be easier for Matt. The plan was for her to change in the hotel room, and Dan was to meet her at the restaurant. She was a little overwhelmed by the luxury of the hotel. Her casual clothes didn't match the setting. She took the key to the pre-booked room, and upon entering, she discovered it was a suite. There were flowers on the table and 2 gift-wrapped boxes on the bed. Opening the larger box, she found a very expensive and glamorous silver satin full-length dress with a neckline and a thigh-length slit. The second box contained a red satin corset, matching thong and luxurious black stitched stockings. She hesitated, but decided there was no harm in trying them on. Surprisingly, they all fit perfectly, and she had to admit that she felt very good in them. She made the decision not to take them off and went down to the restaurant. Dan greeted her, gaping at how stunning Susan looked. The dinner and wine that followed was exquisite. The atmosphere was very tense, knowing what would follow. In Dan's company, Susan felt more relaxed and decided to go along with the whole scenario rather than fight against it. When they returned to the room, the way Dan slowly undressed her, being very sensual, she enjoyed his reaction to her underwear. His hands slid all over her body. She loved the way the corset emphasized her breasts and hips, and the stockings felt so luxurious and exquisitely silky. She had to admit that Dan was an attentive and caring lover, with an element of confidence and danger that she had never encountered with her husband. The next morning, after another bout of sex, Susan changed into her casual clothes. She explained to Dan that she couldn't risk taking her dress or underwear home. Dan agreed to keep them at his house for Susan's future use. Susan sighed, remembering that this would be a long-term arrangement. Her emotions were in turmoil. She wasn't sure how she felt about what was happening. There was plenty of guilt, of course, but she couldn't deny the feelings of excitement and satisfaction. Matt lay awake for most of Friday night. By 10 a.m. Saturday morning, Susan hadn't returned, and once again, this was outside the realm of agreement. He doubted Dan would resist taking Susan again this morning, and he wasn't sure she would even try to avoid it. No matter how much he tried to resist, he was losing trust in Susan, and if that happened, it could mean the end of his marriage. He had never felt so far away from Susan and so alone. "Susan, that kiss was such a bad move. It upset Matt more than anything else, and then breakfast for Dan. What was I thinking?" In fact, she was beginning to think the whole thing was a terrible idea. From her point of view, her time with Dan was easier than she thought. He was respectably handsome and exciting. The money and cars certainly helped. She always aspired to better things. Her dilemma was that sex with him was hot, very hot. It was a constant struggle to keep from screaming, yelling, and asking for more. She had hoped that Matt would get used to what was happening and come to his senses. But it had been 3 weeks, and he remained moody. They hadn't made love either, which she desperately wanted to fix. She loved him so much and regretted the position they were now in. She tried to tell Matt that she was coping and he shouldn't feel guilty. Then she said that Dan was good to her. It was just sex, not love, and he didn't want to keep them apart, but it had no effect. Matt looked defeated and lost, his constant, reassuring presence in her life becoming a distant memory. When he arrived at work on Monday, Dan informed Matt that he needed to attend a training event out of town on Wednesday and Thursday next week. Matt was immediately wary, but given his precarious position at work, he had no choice but to agree. "Okay, I can do that, but it doesn't affect our personal relationship. You can't come over when I'm not home." Dan replied, "Of course not." When he broke the news to Susan that evening, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. The course wasn't a regular occurrence, but it happened once or twice a year. It just seemed too convenient for Matt. He went to the kitchen. His intention to plan his way out of the predicament lost the battle against the blinding headache. As he walked back up the stairs to find a painkiller, he heard Susan talking on the phone, catching her part of the conversation. He wondered who she was talking to and listened to her part of the conversation. "What are you doing, sending Matt on a trip?" "No, that's not a good idea. Things aren't working out, and you coming along will only make things worse." "No, he hasn't thought of anything yet. He seems to have given up and resigned himself to it." "I thought it wouldn't be like this. He's devastated. You know I like our time together. I know it was my idea, but I didn't expect him to be so upset. It was supposed to be a safe alternative to our affair without the risk of being discovered. I didn't envision all of this. I helped you with the kissing and breakfast, and meanwhile you acted like an arrogant asshole smirking in his face." "Okay, you can come during his trip, but then I think we'll need to cut it all short and be more restrained, or maybe even end it. If you offer to end this arrangement because you see how it's affecting Matt, then you'll be a good guy, and we can get back to normal. Maybe if you're careful, we could see each other occasionally." "Yeah, we'll talk later, but I really need to fix things with Matt. I still love him." Matt staggered down the stairs, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. He really had just heard it all. He couldn't fathom all the implications. No wonder Dan seemed to have anticipated all his plans. Susan had told him about it beforehand, and it had been her idea in the first place. She had suggested it and convinced Matt to borrow the money against his better judgment. It also explained how Dan had discovered the discrepancy in the first place. It was so hidden that he didn't think even an audit would have been able to find it. If he wasn't married to a saint, which kept him out of jail, he was actually married to a cheating and conniving bitch. Thoughts of revenge and violence flashed through his mind. Everything came over him. He knew he had to calm down and think rationally. He needed a plan, preferably one that would make them start to sense his anxiety. Matt avoided Susan for the rest of the night and the next morning. When he saw Susan on Tuesday night, he didn't mention the overheard call, but said he heard Dan at work bragging about getting some top-notch woman. Matt went on to say that he could only pray that he didn't mention Susan by name. Matt left early Wednesday morning for his trip, and Susan told him that she loved him. He smiled briefly and pretended to be distracted, checking the schedule on his phone as he set off. Dan arrived at Susan's on Wednesday morning, and she immediately asked about the bragging, but Dan denied everything, blaming Matt for stirring things up. Susan didn't know who to believe. She saw no reason why Matt could have made it up, but maybe Dan was less discreet than she thought, which would be problematic. In between sex, they discussed the situation and what they could do about it. Susan lacked the emotional connection she had with Matt. What she had with Dan was purely sex. Before leaving Thursday afternoon, Dan convinced Susan to continue their affair, but Susan made it clear that it would be the last time until things got better with her and Matt. As they walked out of the house, Dan stopped, unable to believe what he was looking at. There was a large kitchen knife lying on the gleaming hood of his Aston Martin. He looked around, but no one was there. All 4 tires were slashed, too. He went back into the house and told Susan. They both started to panic. Matt could have come home earlier that he knew. It had to be him, unless it was kids or someone jealous of the flashy car. This wasn't the first time it had been vandalized. Susan called Matt and asked how the course went. He casually confirmed that it went uneventful. He didn't need to be there and was starting to get ready to go home. He spoke calmly and didn't ask about Dan. Susan said she couldn't wait to see him and ended the conversation. She recounted the conversation to Dan, saying that he didn't seem upset. Maybe it was just the kids. Either way, they needed to get the car towed before Matt got home, which led to several frantic calls and expensive payments. All seemed normal when Matt returned Thursday night. Susan tiptoed around him, playing the dutiful wife. The surprise was Dan's text message confirming that he wanted to come over on Friday, but only to discuss the situation. Susan smiled, thinking that Dan was going to put an end to everything. Maybe the car had scared him enough to stop everything. Friday morning, Matt went to work as usual. At 11 a.m., he called Susan from work in a panic-stricken voice, telling her that there was something she needed to see. Matt explained that he had just received a video clip via their personal email, and she needed to see it. Susan opened their email on her phone, found the message, and opened the video clip. The video quality was poor and only 20 seconds long, but it was unmistakably Susan and Dan having sex. The sender was an anonymous address. Matt. "Oh my God, is that our bedroom? It's hard to tell, but it looks sunny. Looks like the middle of the day, so I'm not sure when it might be." Susan knew exactly when it was, but replied, "I'm not sure. Maybe it's edited, and they messed up the light." Matt. "It's you, isn't it? You seem to like it." Susan let that comment pass her ears. She had more important concerns and could explain her enthusiasm to Matt later as part of the introduction to Dan. Matt continued, "What Dan is playing is what he wanted to discuss tonight. Isn't this just another form of torture? It's not like you lashed out and threatened him." Susan immediately started to deny it, but then remembered telling Dan of her intention to end the relationship. Perhaps he had reacted badly and intended to use the videotape to continue the relationship. He must have set up the videotape at some point. He'd had ample opportunity to do so over the course of 2 days. Matt said that Dan wasn't at work, so he couldn't ask him. Susan desperately wanted to contact him and was still hoping to discuss their activities over the previous few days. At that moment, Susan's phone rang with an urgent call me message. It was her sister, Diane. She told Matt that she had better answer it, hoping it would give her time to think. She finished talking to Matt and called Diane, but was met with a barrage of questions and scolding. When Diane finally caught her breath, Susan managed to find out that her sister had gotten the same video clip. Her phone continued to beep with calls that most of her close friends and even her mom tried to make. My God, did they all really get that clip? It was an absolute disaster. There was no way Matt could have done this to me. It had to be Dan. Susan was furious. She had tried repeatedly to call Dan but couldn't get an answer. The reason she couldn't reach Dan was because Matt had taken his phone at work when he was in a meeting. He had thrown the battery in the trash and kept the handset and SIM card. He also left an envelope on Dan's desk, after which he called Susan about the video and quietly left work. Back at home, Matt enjoyed watching his wife upset and confused by what was happening. She was upset that her mom had seen the video, and all her family and friends would think she was having an affair. Matt played along, making various unhelpful suggestions about how to limit the damage and adding his own doubts about when the clip might have been filmed. Susan still didn't acknowledge Dan's midweek visit. Susan, how could things have gone so horribly wrong? She never thought about having an affair until she got drunk at a party and started flirting too much with Dan. He was handsome, attractive, and clearly interested. After that night, he'd been on her mind a lot. Over the weeks, she'd managed to convince herself that she deserved some excitement, but dared not risk her marriage to Matt. She'd seen her friend's marriage fall apart after a similar affair was discovered, but she'd always been smart and thought her plan was a smart way to avoid all the pitfalls of discovering an affair. After all, how could Matt discover something he already knew about? Working out the details had become a challenge, and that was all part of the excitement. From her point of view, it was a wonderful arrangement, but she had never thought about how it would affect Matt. Now she was in a lot of pain. Everyone liked Matt, and everyone knew she had cheated on him. She dreaded imagining how she would try to explain her way out of the situation. No one would ever believe that Matt knew about her sex with Dan. But none of that mattered as long as she could convince Matt that it wasn't her fault. The squeal of Dan's tires heralded his arrival at Matt and Susan's house. He was met by Susan trying to attack him. Matt did nothing to stop her, noting the impressive scratch on Dan's cheek. Eventually, Dan managed to pin Susan against the wall long enough for her to talk. Dan heard about the video, but insisted that he hadn't filmed or sent it. Susan got angry. "But if it wasn't you, then who—" Matt started laughing. "Then it must have been me." Susan and Dan looked dumbfounded. Dan was the first to pick up on it. "So you found out about our meeting this week?" Matt: "Alas, yes." Susan began trying to justify it as a continuation of the arrangement. Once again, Dan caught all the implications of the videotape. He knew they had discussed the whole situation and suspected that Matt had taped the whole thing. He tried to smooth things over a bit. "I'm sorry, Matt. I just couldn't resist Susan. I never meant for it to hurt you like that. I made a big error in judgment and just got carried away. I will terminate the contract and ignore the financial irregularities." Matt: "That's so nice of you, but I'm afraid it's too late. You'll find my resignation letter on your desk." Susan cut in: "You can't, Matt. How are we going to pay for the house?" Matt: "Don't worry about it, honey. It will be on the market tomorrow." Dan jumped up: "No need, Matt. We can put this behind us. I really need you at the firm. You know the business and the clients inside out." Matt smiled: "I think that's true. Perhaps that's why your main competitor offered me the job. I suspect some, maybe even most of the clients will move with me. You owe me more vacation days than the 4-week notice period, so I won't be coming back." Dan's fake smile faded. Matt continued: "I suspect some of the staff will be leaving too. I told them I was leaving, and most of them don't seem to think you have what it takes to keep the company going." Dan seconded: "You need to think this through, Matt. You could still go to jail." Matt: "Oh, I don't think so. Would you want to involve your mistress? She got half the benefit of the fraud. Anyway, you committed blackmail, and thanks to your little effort here, I have this confession on video. It's amazing what electronic devices you can buy these days. The recording is in my attorney's possession. Also, you may find that some of your files were mistakenly deleted, and I know you didn't do a remote backup. It's good to have co-workers who enjoy working with you, but I guess you don't know that." Dan grinned: "That tape will never be presented in court." Matt replied: "Funny enough, my lawyer said the same thing, but I can use it for other purposes, and by the time this is settled, you'll be out of business. On the other hand, my new firm might want to buy you out. I hear their new COO is a decent man." Susan realized that compared to Dan, his business and money were in serious jeopardy. She decided to take it out on Dan. Dan listened in bewilderment as Susan launched into an impressive game of hurt woman. "I love you, Matt. It was all Dan's idea. He made me do it. I admit I got confused and a little carried away, but I was just going for it to save you from jail. I had no choice, and my life fell apart because of it. Please, Matt, I love you." Dan muttered: "You two-faced lying bitch." Matt smiled at such an apt description. "Ah, my dear, loving wife, in addition to the video, you're overlooking the fact that I overheard you confess on the phone that this was all your idea, a rather elaborate and cruel cover-up for an affair. You'll find the divorce papers in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. You're leaving tonight, and you have to agree to the terms of the divorce, or all those video clips could end up with family and friends. I'm sure your mom will be happy to hear that not only are you a cheating whore, but also the extent to which you schemed and blackmailed." Susan burst into tears and fell to the floor. Matt looked at Dan. "Do you want to take her with you?" Dan: "No way, she's more trouble than she's worth." Matt: "Well, I agree with that." Dan: "This isn't over, Matt." Matt: "That's true." At that moment, Matt took a swing at Dan, and he wasn't sure who was more surprised when his fist slammed into Dan's jaw, knocking him to the ground. "It's over now." Epilogue. Matt listened to the tape a few times. Most of it was excruciating, but he liked the part where Dan and Susan worried if he'd found out and gone crazy. The knife in the hood was wonderfully melodramatic, and he smiled for the first time in weeks. Matt had indeed taken a new job with Dan's competitor, and the customers and employees followed. Dan hung on as best he could, but eventually he had to put his firm into administration, and there were rumors of his personal bankruptcy. He moved out of the neighborhood shortly thereafter. Susan was left to live in a small apartment with the money from the sale of the house, but no other income from Matt. As a result, with no qualifications or experience, she worked 2 temporary jobs as a housekeeper and waitress. Her former friends shunned her, and she barely spoke to her mother and sister. A pay raise and bonuses allowed Matt to switch to a 3-day work week, and find time for the sports and outdoor activities he had neglected in his marriage. He didn't realize how much Susan had influenced his decisions, including buying a big house and filling it with stuff, but he wasted no time in selling it. He kept in touch with Susan's mother and sister. Diane, in particular, kept apologizing for her sister's cheating, assuring him that he would never repeat her mistake. Matt wondered exactly what she meant, thinking it would be fun to find out at some point, especially since Susan would be furious. My wife and I have been married for a little over 20 years. I am 42 years old and my wife just won 4-0. We are happy and have 2 teenage children, Darcy, who is 17, and David, who is 15. I had already graduated from college and Macy was in her senior year of college when we got married. I'm an engineering manager at a mid-sized engineering firm in the city, and Macy is a paralegal at a large law firm. We are both active and healthy. We spend at least an hour at the gym several times a week. We also love being outdoors and often go hiking when the weather permits. I'm John Hopper. My height is 180 centimeters and my weight is about 82 kilograms. I'm not going to tell you that I'm some kind of super stud, but I can please my wife when we make love often. This usually happens about 2 or 3 times a week. Macy is about 170 centimeters tall, has C-shaped breasts, a flat stomach, and a nice curve to her hips. Overall, she is still very attractive. Heads turned on her whenever we went out anywhere, especially if she was dressed down. My children were wonderful. They were poised, got good grades, and enjoyed some popularity in their school. They were the greatest joy in my life, along with my beautiful wife. I rarely missed one of their games or school performances. I actively participated in their extracurricular activities. I helped them with their homework and took them hiking and camping on weekends. As an engineering manager, I mostly delegated the actual engineering functions to my staff, so I didn't have to work overtime or weekends. Travel was minimal, just to conferences once or twice a year. Macy sometimes had to work overtime when she was working on a big case, but it wasn't really that much. Okay, that pretty much sums up our lives. Obviously, if that was all there was to it, it would be a pretty boring story. Storm clouds were gathering that I wasn't paying attention to. They came in the form of a brash young lawyer who was hired at the law firm where my wife worked. His name was Brandon Howard. He was a big guy who was 190 centimeters tall and weighed about 105 pounds. He worked out a lot to relieve stress at work, so he wasn't overweight. He was opinionated, cocky, and arrogant. In addition, he was constantly lonely. I first met him at one of my wife's work events. He flirted with her continuously throughout the evening. She even flirted back slightly as I stood there. When I voiced my displeasure, she told me to grow up and that it was completely harmless. Once we got home, I tried to explain to her that while I trusted her completely, my problem was that it was completely disrespectful of her to flirt with another man right in front of her husband. I don't think she completely agreed with me that she was behaving inappropriately, but she at least acknowledged my concerns. It took another day or 2 before things returned to normal. Life went on for another 6 months. Macy was working on a major case that had been in the works for about 2 years. It was finally coming to an end. She started working long hours. I know what you're thinking right now, and no, she wasn't fooling me. It was a legitimate matter, and we discussed it thoroughly. She also called home at least once a night to make sure everything was okay. There were also several other people who worked late into the night. As I found out later, although they didn't really have an affair, the flirting still continued and even intensified. The matter was finally settled in favor of a client of my wife's firm. To celebrate, one of the senior partners rented a cabin about 4 hours away in the mountains. He invited everyone who worked on the case over for a weekend with his other half. I knew the partner pretty well, and we had actually been to the cabin a few times before. As I said, the kids were 15 and 17 years old. They were pretty responsible and were at an age where they could take care of themselves. We decided to leave them home alone rather than leave them with my wife's parents. Yes, I warned them against any bad behavior. With that decision made, Macy and I packed our bags and left Friday afternoon. We got to the cottage in the early evening and carried our bags to the room we were to use. Aside from the fact that we had to endure Brandon flirting with my wife all evening, it was rather unpleasant. After telling my wife of my displeasure at her continued flirting with Brandon, I decided to just leave her alone and socialize with Charles and Louise, the owners of the cottage. Like I said, I liked Chuck and Lou, as they preferred to be called casually. We had quite a few similar interests. After dinner and sitting around the fire on the back patio, it was getting late, and I picked up my wife to put her to bed. I was actually very tired and still a little angry with my wife, so I moved away from her and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Macy was still asleep next to me, so I quietly got out of bed, put on shorts and a t-shirt, and then went in search of wake-up juice. I walked into the kitchen and found Chuck and Lou busy preparing a hearty breakfast. Grabbing my coffee, I walked over and started helping. It was quite a production, as besides Chuck and Lou, there were two other couples there, my wife and I and Brandon. George was another lawyer. He was here with his wife, Anne. Kathy was another paralegal who brought her husband, James. Eventually, everyone managed to make their way into the kitchen just as breakfast was ending. By the time I picked up my plate and headed to the table, I found Brandon had taken my seat next to my wife. "I'm sorry, but you're sitting in my seat," I stated kindly. "Oh, dear," Macy replied. "We're just in the middle of a conversation. Could you sit over there, please, just for now?" "But, dear, I've been a little busy helping out. I was looking forward to sitting and chatting with his wife over breakfast." "It's only going to be okay this one time. After all, we can talk all the time, but I rarely get to chat with my coworkers outside of the office." I was truly stunned. I decided that I really wasn't hungry after all, so I picked up my plate and set it on the counter. Filling my cup of coffee again, I went out to the back terrace and sat alone. Analyzing what had just happened, I remembered the expressions of several other faces when it happened. Something was happening here, and I had the distinct impression that I would not be happy with the outcome. As the day progressed, things were not going so well. Macy spent most of her time around Brandon. The only time she really spent with me was when we were both socializing with other people. When we went camping, she would walk with Brandon. We went swimming in the lake, and she spent time with Brandon. I managed to remind her several times that she is my wife, not Brandon's girlfriend. She just guffawed and said my imagination was running wild. By the time dinner was over, I was fed up. When we went out on the terrace to enjoy the evening and have a drink, I timed it perfectly. My wife had just sat down, and when Brandon started to sit down next to her, I moved over and pushed his hip out of the way as I sat down myself. Macy was not pleased. She threw one of her annoyed looks at me. I just smiled back and took her hand. She tried to wrench it away, but I only squeezed harder, refusing to let go. Instead, she practically refused to speak to me. It was a rather unpleasant couple hours as everyone else felt the tension. I had finally had enough. This weekend had turned into a complete disaster. I apologized, explaining that I was tired from the day's activities and got up to go to bed. I walked into the kitchen to refresh my drink. My plan was to pack before bed so I wouldn't be rushed the next morning before returning home. I was just screwing the cap on the bottle of bourbon when Macy walked in. "John, I need to talk to you for a minute before you go to bed." "Well, Macy, I'm kind of surprised by that. We had all day to talk, but you preferred to talk to everyone but me. In fact, you talked to Brandon almost non-stop, but you barely said a word to your husband. At least she had the decency to blush." "Yeah, well, see, I have to explain it." "Then this should be interesting. First of all, I need you to realize that I have never cheated on you. Ever. Judging by the way you acted this weekend, I'm not so sure about that." "That's true. Okay, Brandon and I flirted a little bit, but that's it. He never once really even touched me, except to help me through a few obstacles during our hike today. Now, like I said, I've been completely faithful to you, and it would never even occur to me to cheat on you. But there is no but about it. That's why I'm here talking to you. Now, I have to admit that there is a pretty strong sexual attraction between Brandon and me. The flirting we have been doing has led to some sexual tension. That's why I need to let you know that I will be spending the night with him. I needed to tell you and be upfront about it so it wouldn't be cheating. I'm not going to go behind your back. You're not? What? I said no, I'm not going to let that happen. Look, I've already made up my mind about this. There's just so much sexual tension between us that I have to do it and see what's up. It's just this one time, and then when we get home tomorrow, I'll be all yours again. Let me be perfectly clear. I won't accept this. I won't approve. If you go through with this, there will be terrible consequences. Aya will standing for this. Baby, if you really love me, you'd let me do this once. Baby, if you really love me, you wouldn't even ask for it. Hell, you wouldn't even think about it. John, I really need to do this. It's just this one time. Then I'll come back and be completely faithful to you again. Macy, do you remember our wedding vows? Especially the part about forsaking all others? Furthermore, since you feel the need to break this vow that you willingly made before God and before all of our friends and family, why should I believe this promise made quietly, without witnesses? Okay, John, I can see that you're angry about this right now. I really need to do this, so I'll see you in the morning. We can discuss it tomorrow on the way home. With those words, she turned and walked back outside. Just like that, 20 years of a happy marriage was flushed down the toilet. She expected me to be a faithful husband and wait for her to fly back into my open arms the next morning. I don't work that way. We've discussed this several times. More than one friend of ours had cheated on their spouse, and we talked about it. We didn't have a hall pass to cheating. Cheating was a deal breaker, and I don't care if she told me about it first. Cheating is not just acting secretly behind another's back. The very act of having sex with someone else is cheating. I poured my drink down the sink. I didn't need another one for what I was about to do. I went up to my room and gathered all my things. I left Macy's stuff as is. She could take care of her own shit. Turning out the lights in the room, I sat on the bed and waited. An hour passed before I heard everyone come back into the house and go to their rooms. I waited another half hour to make sure everyone was either asleep or distracted by something else. Grabbing my bag, I quietly walked out of the room and closed the door. I managed to make my way outside almost silently. Luckily, my car was parked the farthest away. It was a fairly new car, so it was quiet when I started it up and touched down. It was just after 2 o'clock in the morning when I pulled up to our house. I noticed that there was a light on, so it was obvious that at least one of the kids was still awake. Sighing, I got out, grabbed my bag, and went inside. Sure enough, both kids were already up and watching a movie. "Hi, Daddy. What are you doing here already? I didn't think you'd be back until tomorrow. Later today." Darcy noticed. "Yeah, where's Mom?" David added. Well, by answering David's question, I can answer both questions. Your mom is still at the cottage in her lover's bed. Yes, I'm an asshole for dragging our kids into the personal business between their mom and me, but I thought being honest with them would prepare them for the changes to come. Okay, maybe I could have at least handled it more diplomatically, but I didn't feel much remorse at the time. What do you mean, in your lover's bed? Is Mom really cheating on you? Darcy was almost shouting. That's exactly what I meant. She cornered me this evening and told me she was going to sleep with someone else tonight. I decided I didn't want to wait for that, so I packed up and came home. I let her lover give her a ride home. I didn't think I would have to wait for her anywhere in the neighborhood. We talked some more. Then I carried my bag to the spare room. I spent the next hour moving all my stuff from the room we used to share to what would now be my room. Luckily, the guest room was a second master bedroom with its own bathroom. The bed was pretty comfortable, too. As soon as I was moved, I fell onto the bed and fell into an exhausted sleep. I woke up a few hours later to my phone ringing. Glancing at it, I noticed it was my wife calling. I sent it to voicemail. Looking closer, I saw that she had left half a dozen text messages, and this was her third call. Just for interest, I read the messages and listened to the voicemails. First were her inquisitive questions about where I was and that breakfast was almost ready. Then they were concerned about where I was. The later ones were angry, demanding to know where I was and demanding that I get my ass back there to pick her up and take her home. The latter informed me that she had to ask someone for a ride and that she would kick my ass as soon as she got home. Oh well, I was already awake, so I should have gotten up and prepared to face the new day. Hurricane Macy would be arriving in about 4 hours, and I needed to get ready for the storm. I had a feeling she was going to be pissed. There was no remorse in the last message she left. I got up, showered, got dressed, and headed downstairs for breakfast. By the time I finished eating, the kids were up. I explained to them that they should probably stay out of the crossfire since their mother wasn't in a very good mood. Surprisingly, they just laughed it off. I had a bad feeling about what would happen when she got home. They didn't seem too happy with what she had done. "Where the hell have you been, asshole?" The slamming door announced the arrival of Miss Congeniality. "I'm sorry, I just couldn't help myself." She just laid it out right there like a low outside curve. I swung around and threw it over the fence. How was the evening? I really didn't think a human face could have such a dark shade of red. Oops, sorry. Now it's turning purple. I was just about to pull out my phone to call an ambulance in case she had a stroke when the explosion went off. What the hell kind of idea was it to leave me out there like that? Do you have any idea how humiliating it was for me this morning when everyone found out you left and I had to beg for a ride home? You bastard! I was going to get you into bed tonight, but now you can just forget about it. I just smiled back at her. I was actually amazed at the composure I was showing her. First of all, honey, I don't care how humiliating you may find it. Believe me, it was nowhere near as humiliating as it was for me when you jumped into bed with that asshole and everyone knew it. Secondly, I have absolutely no interest in ever sleeping in the same bed with you again. Now you're damaged goods. How can you talk to me like that? I'm your wife. No, you're not. Well, maybe on paper you still are, but in reality, my wife disappeared yesterday. You're just a cheating wench. What are you talking about? We discussed this last night. I told you about it beforehand, so I wasn't cheating. Okay, let me ask you a couple questions. 1. Did you sleep with someone last night who wasn't your husband? Yes. I told you I was going to get in bed with Brandon. Okay then. Because you let someone other than your husband fuck you, you cheated. End of story. It doesn't matter if you told me about it or not. In fact, you didn't even ask. You said you had already made up your mind and that I had no say in it. I even told you not to do it. I told you I was totally against it. You just went ahead and did it anyway. But if you really love me, you'll let me do it. If you really love me, we can get through this. You stupid fool! If you really loved me, you would never even think of cheating on me. With those words, I turned around and went into the garage to work on my 1969 Nova. It was originally an inline 6-cylinder engine with a 3-speed manual transmission. I replaced the engine with a 383 small block, and the transmission was now a Borg-Warner Super T10 4-speed. Yes, I know that many new gearboxes use a Restamod, installing a newer computer-controlled engine. Of course, they get more power and better fuel economy. I'm old school. I hate all that computer-controlled crap. It takes a computer genius just to keep the stupid thing running. With the old engine, I could screw it in, plug it in, and it would work. This is newer shit. You screw it in, plug it in, install a computer controller, then take it somewhere else and pay a guy another $1,000 to set it up before you run it. No thanks. Over the next few months, Macy tried to get me to talk. I wasn't interested. She also tried several times to get into my room late at night. I had changed the locks and she didn't have a key. To me, we were now just platonic housemates who happened to have 2 children in common. Why didn't I just divorce her? The kids. I didn't want to be just a part-time dad. I loved my kids and I wanted to be there for them. Besides, I only had 3 years left before David would graduate and go to college. Macy tried to get the kids involved to get me to talk to her. Nothing good came of it. The kids were seriously pissed off at what she did. She tried to confront me to turn them against me. It was Darcy who set her straight. Mom, Dad never said anything bad about you to us. You, on the other hand, have complained to us about him several times. Don't blame Dad for turning us against you. You did it on your own. Yeah, times were tough on the Hopper family. After 4 months, Macy started wearing very little around the house when the kids weren't around. She started wearing very sexy lingerie to try to lure me into her bed, or my bed. Whatever worked for me. I have to admit it was hard to resist at times. After all, she is a very sexy woman. Nevertheless, I was determined. I just couldn't get past her cheating. It's been 6 months since that night. "I can't take it anymore, John," she said, dressed in a sheer black negligee. "I need you. It's been 6 months since we had sex. I need you to come to my bed." "Why don't you go to your lover and ask him to do it?" "I don't have another lover, John. I haven't had sex since that night at the cabin. I need you now. And if you refuse to fulfill your conjugal duties, I'll have to go out and find someone else to do your job." Well, that was an ultimatum. I looked at her and said, "Just don't bring them here. I will not tolerate you bringing any of your lovers into my house. Go to their home, a motel, or even the back seat of their car. But don't bring them here." A dejected expression appeared on her face. Then she turned and ran out of the room, sobbing. "Choices have consequences. I don't want anyone else. I just want you." I heard her sobs as she ran out of the room. You may be wondering why I didn't take the opportunity to just sleep with her. After all, she's a very beautiful woman, and it's been 6 months since then. Well, that's true, and I was tempted. The problem was that I just couldn't get over the fact that she had willingly humiliated me in front of her co-workers. Every time I tried to think about having sex with her, all I pictured was her co-workers laughing at me as she lay on her bed. I lost all desire for her. Sure, she was beautiful on the outside, but all I could see was the ugliness inside her. It was a week later, Saturday night. I was lounging in the living room, drinking a scotch and soda and reading a book. Macy came down the stairs and stood in front of me. She was wearing LBD jeans, stockings, 12-inch CFM heels, and her expensive jewelry. Her hair and makeup were done to perfection. She looked like she was ready to go to one of the swankiest holiday parties we used to go to together. "John, I need you. I want you. I'm begging you. Please take me upstairs. I can't take it anymore, so if you're not going to take me, I'm going to go find someone who will. I told you last week I'd do it if you said no. This is your last chance. Please don't make me walk out that door." "You look really nice," I replied. "I have no doubt you'll find someone to spend the night with. Just be prepared, because if you sleep with someone, I will consider it as your permission for me to do it too. If you walk out that door and have fun with another person, I will view that as an open marriage in which we are both free to have sex with other people." "God damn it, John, that's not what I want. I willingly offer myself to you, but you keep turning me down. I don't want to sleep with other people. I sure as hell don't want you to sleep with other women. You're driving me to it. It's not the same thing. If you don't want me anymore, why don't you just divorce me?" "Is that what you want? Do you want me to divorce you?" "Hell no! I want you to take me back as your devoted wife. You weren't very faithful to me in the cabin, so why should I expect you to be faithful to me now?" "Because I promised to be!" "And a little over 20 years ago, you vowed to be the same. What makes you think I can believe any of your promises now?" "Fine. If you do, don't wait." "Fine. If it's your choice, I'll start making arrangements with a couple of ladies who have shown a pretty open interest in me." "You're the one who's forcing the issue. If you go with another woman, I'll divorce your ass so fast you won't even know what hit you. I'll get the house, the kids, and more than half of the assets. You'll end up living in a one-bedroom apartment and eating prime ramen because of all the child support and spousal support you'll have to pay. Then, just to spite you, I'll interfere with your visitation, too." "Yeah, good luck with that. You do realize that kids are old enough to determine which parent they want to live with, right? You want to bet on who it's going to be? Go ahead, go out and have fun. I really don't care," she cried again. "What do you want from me? How long are you going to punish me? What can I do to make you love me again?" She burst into tears. "There is absolutely nothing you can do. You've already done it, once and done. You screwed another man and humiliated me in front of your friends. As for what I want from you, I want to coexist in this house as roommates for the next 3 years. Once David turns 18, graduates from high school and goes to college, we will divorce and go our separate ways. Until then, we will live in the same house and raise our children together. If you want to divorce me before then, go ahead. I can't stop you. Just keep in mind that the kids will probably want to live with me. That means I'll stay here in the house, and you'll pay child support." "Macy, I just can't trust you anymore. I can't live with the idea of my wife sleeping with someone else every time she's not home. I can't live with the thought of the next time you break your promise to be faithful. I only have two options here. The first is to divorce you now, and then the kids will have two part-time parents. The other option is to live in the same house, where we will both have freedom, but the kids will run the household with two parents. We will live in the same house, but will be divorced in every way except on paper. You are free to date as much as you want, as am I. We just won't bring anyone home with us. She did go out that evening, after washing her face and applying her makeup. As promised, I also started seeing other women. After a month, she seemed resigned to her fate. We were polite to each other and practically lived as platonic roommates while we raised our children. We acted like a family. When either of us had a party, we usually went together. We had to maintain this farce in public. Of course, it wasn't long before all of our coworkers realized what was going on. Heck, I dated a few single women in my office, as did she with some of the guys she worked with. Yes, she was constantly trying to lure me into her bed, but I mostly refused. Okay, sure, I gave in to her a couple times. She was still a beautiful woman, and after a couple drinks, I let my little head make the decision, and it was sex, not lovemaking. "So, is that it?" said Macy with tears in her eyes. "That's it," I replied, loading another box into my truck. "Thank you for 20 wonderful years, Macy." "That was 23 years ago." "I know." "Yeah." Tears came to her eyes again, and it's been a little over 3 years. David had just moved into his dormitory for college. Darcy was about to start her freshman year at university. The house was sold and we were packing up to move out. We were moving apart in different directions. The divorce had already started and we were just biding our time until the final judgment was handed down. The assets were split 50-50. The kids' college accounts were already fully funded. "I still love you, you know," she whispered. "I know I do. I'm sorry." "I am too." She turned to look at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You will? Will you call me sometimes? Come to see me sometimes? Maybe we can see each other once in a while, please? No commitment, just to see each other." My hatred for what she had done had long since dissipated. I no longer felt the same love, but I didn't despise her either. In fact, I saw her as something of a friend. Besides, we still had kids to bond over, and frankly, she was damn good in bed. Of course she was. We can do that. Besides, we'd have kids' birthdays, graduations, weddings, and grandchildren's births that we'd both attend. Epilogue. The children forgave Macy for what she had done. Their relationship improved, but never returned to what it was before. Macy bought a small 3-bedroom apartment so the kids could visit her when they came to town. I bought a small house with a couple acres of land and a workshop. It was a pretty small town, so we still saw each other occasionally. I would call her and she would call me. We even went out together a few times. No, we never had a chance to get back together, although she tried. We each went out quite a bit. She ended up having several pretty long-term relationships. I was just satisfied with not being married. I decided I had had enough of exclusivity. There are 2 reasons for me to be married. The first is to have and raise children. I had done it before and was too old to do it again. The other reason was to grow old together and have a companion in my old age. It didn't really matter much to me. I had plenty of friends and family if I got lonely. "John, I have a very big favor to ask of you. I understand if you don't want to do it, but I would really like you to at least think about it." We were having lunch at a nice restaurant. It's been 5 years since the divorce. "Ask right away. I assumed you wanted something when you asked me to lunch today. By the way, where's your boyfriend? Won't he be jealous that you invited your ex-husband to lunch?" She smiled. "No, he knows all about our past. He knows he has nothing to worry about. Besides, he was the one who suggested I ask you in private. He thought it might be more uncomfortable if he were here. However, he's willing to take your call if you want to make sure he's okay with that request." "Okay." Cell phone rings. "I'm interested in you. John, Martin made me an offer and I said yes." "Good. Do you love him? Did you finally get past us?" "I'll never completely forget us, John. Still, I've made peace with it. As for Martin, I'm comfortable with him. I really love him, and we're very good together. I've settled down, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life with him. Okay, so what do you want to ask for? If it's my blessing, you have it. But you don't really need it. I have no say in the matter. No, well, I guess that's partly true, but what I want is for you to walk me down the aisle and marry me off at my wedding. Okay, where did this Mack truck come from? Let's talk about something extraneous. My mind just exploded with this. What? I want you to walk me down the aisle and marry me at my wedding. Macy, most ex-wives don't even want their ex-husbands to be present at their new marriages, let alone actually participate in the ceremony. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Then why in God's name do you even think it's a good idea? All right. Hear me out. I've obviously discussed this with Martin, and he agrees with it. I just sat stunned as she explained her train of thought. After listening to her, I had to admit that it made some sense. In a really strange way. John, you've been the most important man in my life, with the exception of my father. As you know, he's no longer alive. Furthermore, you were the last significant relationship of my life. I could talk David into giving me up, but it just doesn't seem right to me for my son to give up his mother. It's like I belonged to my son. I just think it sounds a little strange. Instead, my heart belonged to you for most of my adult life. You were the last man who owned any part of me. Martin and I think it would be appropriate for the last man who owned my heart to give that heart to a new man. After all, even if you still have a piece of my heart, obviously you wouldn't necessarily want to keep it. This would be a great way to show that you're giving it up and passing it on to someone else who will care for and protect it. I think the symbolism of it would show that we are still friends, but our love is completely over, and my new husband is now taking over. Yeah, that sounds crazy to me too. I did call Martin. I did meet up with him that evening for a few drinks at a local bar. He liked the idea too. Sure, he had been skeptical when Macy first brought it up, but after listening to her reasoning and discussing it fully, he liked it. I still wasn't convinced. It just seemed like there was too much weirdness to me. I also called my kids to get their opinion on it. Who is giving this woman away in marriage? Her family and her ex-husband are doing it. Yes, it just sounded wrong on several levels, but that's what she wanted. I have to admit that it seemed to work. I was passing the baton to her new man. I really felt that our relationship had finally come to an end, and her new relationship was complete. Sure, there were a few comments, but for the most part, they were received positively. It certainly made the reception a lot of fun. Several ladies came up to me and asked if I wanted to start a new relationship since I had finally broken up my previous one. I think there might be 3 or 4 among these women who might take a swing at me. We'll see. At least my weekends over the next month or two won't be boring.